Tommy Malone and his brothers, Sean and Danny, were not just Liverpool's most feared criminals. They were architects of an empire built on fear, loyalty, and blood. From the docks to the shadows of the city, they turned their family name into a dynasty that no rival could challenge, and no law could break. The story of the Malone family began not in the gleaming city center of Liverpool, but in the rough, salt-scented docks of the 1960s, where ships from all over the world delivered cargo and danger in equal measure. Tommy Malone was a boy of the streets, born into a family of working-class laborers, where every day was a struggle and every opportunity had to be fought for. From an early age, he learned that survival depended on wit as much as strength. The docks, with their labyrinth of warehouses and narrow alleys, became his playground and his school, teaching him the rules of power that no classroom ever could. Tommy's first forays into crime were small, pocketing valuables from unguarded cargo, running errands for local bookmakers, collecting protection money from struggling stall owners. But even these minor acts carried lessons. He watched how fear could be more powerful than force, how a well-timed threat could bend people to your will. By the time he reached his early 20s, Tommy had cultivated a reputation that mixed respect with fear. He was clever, ruthless when necessary, but disciplined, never losing sight of the bigger picture. Unlike many young men who burned out in the chaos of street life, Tommy had a vision. He wanted more than money. He wanted a legacy. Small-time rackets were only the beginning. Using charm, cunning, and intimidation, he began to weave a network that stretched across Liverpool's neighborhoods. Rival gangs, once a source of petty skirmishes, became opportunities. Tommy was strategic, identifying weaknesses in their operations and exploiting them without unnecessary violence at first. But he never hesitated when confrontation was unavoidable. Word spread quickly. Those who crossed the Malones were marked, and their fate was grim. By the mid-1970s, Tommy's influence was undeniable. He had absorbed smaller gangs into his growing empire, creating a hierarchy that mirrored a legitimate business, though built entirely on fear and loyalty. He recruited family members, giving each a role suited to their strengths. One cousin managed street-level operations, another handled bookkeeping and illicit trades. Even within the family, loyalty was demanded above all else. Betrayal was not merely frowned upon. It was a risk that no one was willing to take. To outsiders, the Malones were a unit that operated like a well-oiled machine, lending street smarts with a disciplined strategy that few could challenge. But Tommy's rise was not without danger. Police interest was increasing, and other gangs were becoming bolder. An unexpected attack on a Malone-run warehouse left several men dead and shook the organization to its core. The incident was a reminder that power came with a cost, and that the streets of Liverpool were unforgiving. Tommy responded swiftly, orchestrating a calculated retaliation that reasserted the Malones' dominance and sent a clear message. Any challenge would be met with ruthless precision. Even as violence and ambition defined his rise, Tommy was a master of perception. He cultivated an image that made him both respected and feared. Merchants and local officials knew to tread carefully, while his family members learned that every action had to serve the larger goal of consolidating power. It was this blend of intelligence, strategy, and unflinching ruthlessness that allowed Tommy Malone to transform a small-time racketeer into the architect of a growing criminal dynasty, one whose shadow would stretch across Liverpool for decades to come. By the late 1970s, the Malone family had grown beyond a street gang. It had become an institution, one that thrived on secrecy, loyalty, and a rigid code that governed every move. Tommy Malone understood that muscle alone was not enough to sustain power. To survive in Liverpool's dangerous underworld, he needed a family that operated like a single organism, every member aware of their role, every action serving the larger goal. The streets respected him, but it was the family that truly carried the weight of the empire. Every Malone had a part to play. Siblings ran operations in different neighborhoods, cousins handled bookkeeping and the flow of money, while trusted childhood friends were turned into enforcers who carried out the family's will without hesitation. Tommy's strategy was simple yet brutal. Loyalty was rewarded, disloyalty was punished, and silence was sacred. No word of the family's business was allowed outside, and even within the organization, information was shared only on a need-to-know basis. This secrecy became the family's shield, a wall no law enforcement agency could easily penetrate. Despite the tight structure, tensions simmered beneath the surface. As the empire grew, so did ambition, even among family members. Arguments over territories, profits, and the direction of operations occasionally flared into violent confrontations. One particularly troubling incident involved a cousin who questioned Tommy's decisions and hinted at secretly dealing with rival gangs. Within days, the cousin vanished. Some claimed he had been forced out of the city, others whispered of a darker fate. The lesson was clear: questioning the Malone hierarchy was not tolerated, and fear was as integral to the family's control as loyalty. Yet fear alone was not enough to maintain the dynasty. Tommy was also a strategist, carefully cultivating alliances with politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement. Bribes, favors, and silent threats ensured that the family's movements went largely unchecked. Local authorities, wary of the Malone's reach, often looked the other way, knowing that interference could come with a heavy price. It was a delicate balance of power, one that required constant attention and careful manipulation. The Malone family also mastered the art of appearances. Outwardly, they blended into Liverpool's working-class neighborhoods, running legitimate businesses and social clubs that masked their illegal activities. These fronts allowed them to launder money, move contraband, and gather intelligence with minimum suspicion. Community members, many of whom owed debts to the Malones or feared retaliation, became unwitting allies, keeping secrets that ensured the family's survival. Still, the risk of betrayal was ever present. The more the empire expanded, the more it attracted attention from rivals seeking to topple it, from insiders tempted by wealth, and from law enforcement increasingly determined to break the family's hold. Tommy responded with a combination of intimidation and careful planning, demonstrating that the Malones were not just a gang, but a dynasty that would endure beyond any single member. Even as the family tightened its grip on Liverpool, whispers of ambition beyond the city began to circulate. Tommy dreamed of extending operations nationally and eventually internationally. Yet he knew that expansion came with heightened risk. One misstep could unravel decades of carefully built power, and as the family grew in influence and notoriety, the line between loyalty and betrayal blurred, leaving everyone to wonder who could be trusted and who was silently plotting the downfall of the dynasty. By the end of the decade, the Malone family had solidified its reputation as both respected and feared. Their code of loyalty and secrecy created an organization that was disciplined, ruthless, and remarkably resilient. But even within the family, shadows lurked, ambitions, grudges, and hidden agendas that threatened to erupt at any moment. The foundation of the empire was strong, but its true strength lay in its ability to adapt, survive, and instill fear. In Liverpool, no other name carried the weight, menace, and influence that the Malones did, and everyone in the city knew that crossing them could have consequences far beyond imagination. By the early 1980s, the Malone family had evolved into a criminal empire that extended far beyond Liverpool's streets. What had started as small-time rackets in the Docklands had grown into an intricate network of smuggling operations, underground gambling dens, and drug distribution channels. Tommy Malone had transformed from a cunning street hustler into a calculating mastermind, one whose influence was felt in every corner of the city. But the empire's expansion brought new challenges: rivals who refused to bow, law enforcement determined to expose them, and the constant threat of betrayal from within. The streets of Liverpool whispered tales of the Malones' ruthlessness. Stories of disappeared men and burned-out spread fear, ensuring that few dared to oppose the family. Yet Tommy understood that fear alone could not sustain an empire. Intelligence and strategy were his most potent tools. The Malone family had eyes and ears everywhere. Trusted allies were placed in key positions: dock workers who reported suspicious shipments, business owners who shared insider information, and even a few corrupt police officers who provided warnings of impending raids. With this network, the Malones could anticipate threats, strike preemptively, and remain one step ahead of both rivals and authority. The family's operations became increasingly sophisticated. Tommy's brothers handled logistics and finance with precision, ensuring that money flowed through legal fronts and overseas accounts to avoid scrutiny. Shipments of contraband arrived and departed with minimal disruption, while local gangs that once resisted the Malones were either absorbed into the network or eliminated quietly. The family's reputation for strategic brilliance grew alongside their wealth, making them untouchable in the eyes of most. But the empire's expansion also attracted attention from forces beyond Liverpool. Rival gangs from Manchester and Birmingham sought to encroach on Malone territory, testing the family's dominance. One particularly bold rival stole a shipment of contraband, sparking a covert retaliation that left the rival's operation in ruins. Violence was inevitable, but Tommy approached each conflict with meticulous planning. Every move was calculated. Every decision weighed for maximum impact with minimal exposure. The Malones had become experts in controlling chaos, turning potential disasters into displays of power that reinforced their dominance. Despite their success, the threat of betrayal loomed large. A trusted lieutenant, once considered loyal, began acting suspiciously, meeting secretly with contacts outside the family. Tommy's instincts, honed over decades, sensed the danger before it fully materialized. Surveillance and intaking a covert retaliation that left the rival's operation in ruins. Violence was inevitable, but Tommy approached each conflict with meticulous planning. Every move was calculated. Every decision weighed for maximum impact with minimal exposure. The Malones had become experts in controlling chaos, turning potential disasters into displays of power that reinforced their dominance. Despite their success, the threat of betrayal loomed large. A trusted lieutenant, once considered loyal, began acting suspiciously, meeting secretly with contacts outside the family. Tommy's instincts, honed over decades, sensed the danger before it fully materialized. Surveillance and intelligence gathering revealed that the lieutenant was feeding information to law enforcement, endangering key operations and threatening the Empire's stability. The revelations shocked the family. It was the first time a member of the inner circle had turned against them, exposing the fragility that lay beneath the Empire's seemingly impenetrable exterior. The betrayal forced the Malones to adapt. Operations became more secretive. Communication tightened, and trust became even harder earned. Tommy realized that expansion had increased the stakes, and that survival required not just strength, but vigilance and adaptability. Each family member was reminded that loyalty was a currency more valuable than money, and that one misstep could unravel everything they had built. By the mid-1980s, the Malone family had cemented their reputation as an empire built on fear, intelligence, and calculated violence. Rival gangs learned quickly that challenging them invited ruin, and law enforcement began to recognize the depth of the family's influence, though capturing them remained a nearly impossible task. Yet beneath the surface, tension and paranoia simmered, a reminder that even the most powerful dynasties were vulnerable from within. Every operation, every deal, carried the potential for betrayal, and every member of the family understood that power was both a shield and a trap. As the city moved around them, the Malones thrived in the shadows, their reach stretching farther than anyone could imagine. The empire was no longer just about dominance in Liverpool. It was a machine built for survival, expansion, and secrecy. In the Underworld, the family's name became synonymous with strategy, cunning, and terror, proving that the Malone dynasty was more than a criminal organization. It was a force capable of shaping the very fabric of the city itself. The 1990s were a turning point for the Malone family. After decades of building an empire in the shadows, the city that had once feared them now witnessed the full force of their power. Liverpool's docks, streets, and neighborhoods became battlegrounds as rival gangs, emboldened by the Malone family's growing influence, began to challenge their dominance. What had once been a network built on careful planning and intimidation was now forced into open conflict. Violence erupted, and the city itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the escalating feud. The first signs of trouble came with a series of attacks on Malone-controlled warehouses. Rival gangs, seeking to make a name for themselves, moved boldly, attempting to hijack shipments and assert control over lucrative routes. The Malones, who had long relied on stealth and strategy, now faced the dangerous reality of public warfare. Burned-out cars lined narrow streets, abandoned docks echoed with the aftermath of gunfire, and whispers of bloodshed spread through Liverpool's working-class neighborhoods. Families feared venturing out at night, and even hardened criminals recognized that this conflict was unlike anything the city had seen in decades. Tommy Malone, now older but sharper than ever, responded with brutal efficiency. He orchestrated retaliation that was both swift and meticulously planned. Rival operations were dismantled, warehouses seized, and the city's underworld reminded that crossing the Malones came at a deadly cost. Yet, while the family's power remained unshaken, the violence revealed vulnerabilities. Law enforcement, long wary of the Malones' reach, now had undeniable evidence of their activities. High-profile arrests began to rattle the organization, forcing Tommy and his brothers to reconsider how they operated. Among the most shocking events was the betrayal of a rising gang leader, someone who had once been a loyal ally and had earned the family's trust. This individual had stolen shipments, disrupted operations, and even conspired with rival factions. The Malones' retaliation was calculated but brutal, sending a clear message to anyone who might consider defiance. The city was left in awe and fear, as news spread of the violence that had erupted and the ruthless measures the Malones employed to maintain control. Amid the chaos, the family began to shift strategies. Open conflict was dangerous and drew unwanted attention from law enforcement, media, and other criminal networks. Tommy realized that the key to survival was not just brute force but adaptability. The Malones moved some operations underground, relied more heavily on trusted family members, and used intelligence to anticipate every threat. Each attack, each confrontation became a lesson in control, teaching the family that power was not simply seized, it was maintained through careful calculation, fear, and foresight. The city itself had changed. Liverpool's streets, once merely corridors for trade and work, now bore the scars of gang warfare. The docks, which had been a symbol of opportunity for Tommy's early rise, had transformed into a perilous chessboard where lives and loyalties were constantly at risk. Merchants, residents, and even other criminals learned to navigate the new reality. The Malone family was both omnipresent and unpredictable. Anyone who underestimated them did so at their own peril. Despite the turbulence, the Malone empire endured. The family adapted, survived arrests, and neutralized rivals with precision. They proved that even in the face of violence, betrayal, and public scrutiny, a dynasty built on strategy, fear, and loyalty could withstand the most extreme tests. By the end of the decade, the Malones were no longer just a local crime family. They were legends of Liverpool's underworld, a force whose reputation extended far beyond the city limits. And while the streets would eventually quiet, the echoes of the bloodshed and the power struggles of this era would continue to define the family for generations to come. By the early 2000s, the Malone family had transformed once again. The streets of Liverpool, scarred by decades of violence, now whispered a different story, one of quiet, calculated power. The open warfare of the 1990s had faded, but the family's influence had only deepened. Tommy Malone's children, raised in the shadow of the docks and groomed in the family's ruthless methods, began to take control. Unlike their father, they relied not only on fear but also on intelligence, technology, and international connections to maintain and expand the empire. The family's operations had become more sophisticated, moving beyond smuggling and street-level control into financial schemes, international trade, and digital operations. Legitimate businesses masked illicit dealings, allowing money to flow freely while law enforcement struggled to trace it. The empire was no longer visible in the streets, as it once had been, yet its power was unmistakable. Rivals learned quickly that even without violence, the Malones could exert control, manipulate outcomes, and shape the criminal landscape across multiple cities and countries. Yet with this evolution came new dangers. Ambition, greed, and the lure of wealth created tensions even among the younger generation. Some cousins and siblings, eager to prove themselves, tested boundaries, making decisions that risked exposure. The family's history of ruthless retribution and strict loyalty codes remained, but the stakes had grown. Betrayal was no longer just a personal threat. It could now unravel the Empire's operations on an international scale. The most shocking revelation came when one of Tommy's own children secretly began collaborating with law enforcement. Using insider knowledge, this individual helped dismantle certain parts of the Malone network, targeting high-value operations while keeping the family unaware of the full extent of the exposure. The betrayal sent shockwaves through the family, revealing that no dynasty, no matter how strong, was immune to the ambitions, resentments, and choices of the next generation. Tommy's careful teachings, his years of experience in strategy and fear, had prepared them for rivals, but not for those born of their own blood. Despite this internal threat, the Malones adapted quickly. Operations became even more secretive, communication tighter, and trust harder to earn. Only those who had proven themselves repeatedly were allowed to handle sensitive matters. Every move was scrutinized, every plan measured against the potential for betrayal. The family learned that survival depended not only on power but on constant vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to act decisively when threats arose. Even with these challenges, the Malone legacy endured. Their name remained synonymous with influence, cunning, and fear in Liverpool and beyond. They had survived decades of rivalries, wars, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal betrayal, proving that the dynasty was not simply built on violence, but on careful planning, loyalty, and an unyielding will to survive. The streets that had once witnessed open conflict now told stories of quiet dominance, with the Malones pulling strings from behind the scenes, shaping the underworld according to their vision. In the end, the story of the Malone family is not only a tale of crime and brutality, but also one of ambition, intelligence, and survival. A family that rose from the docks of Liverpool to command an empire of fear and influence, adapting with every generation, learning from every betrayal, and leaving a legacy that would endure long after the streets themselves had moved on. The dynasty's shadow stretches far and wide, a reminder that in Liverpool power is earned, loyalty is enforced, and bloodlines run deeper than law or morality ever could.